In the dim archives of an old European fortress, historians uncovered a device unlike any other, cold, intricate, and designed with terrifying precision. It wasn't a weapon of war or a tool of justice. It was something else entirely. A device built to break the human spirit, one that targeted women who refused to be silent. Its existence was long denied, its blueprints buried in forgotten ledgers. Official records spoke of interrogation instruments and confession aids, but those who knew its true purpose whispered another name: the silencer. It was never meant to kill. It was meant to humiliate, to make an example of those who spoke out of turn, who questioned power, or who dared to defy the rules written by men. Its cold metal wasn't forged for punishment alone, it was shaped to remind women of their place. The story of this device is not just about pain, it's about resistance, about the women who faced it, endured it, and whose courage echoed far beyond the chambers of fear where their voices were first stolen. This is not a tale of cruelty for spectacle, but a story of survival, of how, even in an age built on silence, the human will to be heard proved stronger than steel. Europe in the 16th century was a continent trembling beneath its own power. Kings ruled with divine authority, the church-dictated conscience and dissent, especially from women, was treated as a flaw in nature itself. It was a time when silence was considered a virtue and obedience the highest form of grace. In England, King Henry VIII had transformed religion into a weapon. After breaking from Rome, he demanded loyalty not only to the throne, but to his personal faith. Those who questioned either were branded traitors. In the grand courts of London and the echoing corridors of the Tower, loyalty was measured not by truth, but by submission. For ordinary citizens, fear became a daily companion. Whispers could end lives. Words could condemn families. Women, especially, lived within invisible borders, told what to believe, what to wear, what to say, and most importantly, when to be silent. A careless comment could be twisted into rebellion. A refusal could be called madness. It was in this world of control that a new form of discipline was born, one hidden behind official documents and sealed chambers. The men who designed it spoke in careful language. Correction, truth extraction, moral instruction. But beneath those phrases lay the same old truth. Power feared what it could not understand. Among the accused were widows who managed their own lands, midwives who knew too much medicine, scholars who read forbidden books, and women whose voices carried too far in public halls. They were not warriors or revolutionaries. They were simply people who refused to bend completely. The Tower of London, once a royal fortress, had by then become a symbol of dread. Its narrow cells smelled of damp stone and candle smoke. Guards spoke in hushed tones of special instruments brought in from the continent, machines meant to teach obedience without blood. Few ever saw them. Fewer still returned to speak of them. The creation of the silencer was not the act of one cruel mind, but of a system convinced it was right. In an age obsessed with order, it promised results without open violence, punishment without public outcry. To those in power, it was a solution, a way to preserve authority while pretending to serve justice. Yet fear has a way of breeding defiance. Every law written to control gave birth to a soul brave enough to question it. In the markets and taverns of London, quiet resistance grew. Women met in secret to share news and prayers. Some smuggled letters from the imprisoned to their families. Others simply refused to be shamed into silence. One chronicler from the period wrote, "They feared the women's tongues more than the men's swords." And perhaps that was true, because even in an age ruled by kings, it was often words, spoken softly, defiantly, or with tears, that changed the course of history. Behind the gilded portraits and sermons, the age of fear was not just about punishment. It was about control through silence. And in that silence, the faint echo of rebellion began to stir. For within the tower's shadows, a handful of women would soon face the new invention, not as victims, but as the first to test whether courage could withstand the weight of a machine built to erase it. In the middle of the 16th century, under the shadow of political unrest, a strange commission was issued in London. It came not from a public decree, but from a letter sealed in crimson wax. Instructions from one of the king's most trusted advisers. The order was simple: construct a device capable of compelling truth without leaving marks of torture. The artisans chosen for the task were men of precision, engineers, blacksmiths and scholars of anatomy. They worked in secrecy within the cellars of the tower, where the clanging of hammers was swallowed by the Thames. Each man was told he served the crown, though none were told what they were building. Piece by piece the device took form, a framework of metal and wood, its joints adjustable, its mechanisms finely tuned. To its creators it was an invention of control, a masterpiece of restraint. To history it would become a symbol of fear. The officials who oversaw it gave it a name meant to sound harmless: the instrument of reflection. They claimed it encouraged moral correction, that those who resisted the truth would be guided to confess. But in the whispers of guards and scribes, another name spread: the silencer. It was said to have no blood upon it, only silence. No records survive describing its exact workings. Some say it was a frame that held the body rigid, forcing stillness until the spirit surrendered. Others believed it relied on sound, a constant, low vibration that broke a person's will through exhaustion and fear. Perhaps the truth is simpler, that the device was never mechanical at all, but psychological, a room, a ritual, a method designed to erase a voice without visible scars. Whatever its form, its purpose was clear. It was not created to punish the guilty, but to control the disobedient. It was power disguised as justice. Only a few were ever subjected to it, and even fewer survived to speak of it. The records that mention it do so only in code. Phrases like, "the questioning was successful," or "the spirit was quieted." In an empire obsessed with order, the silencer became more than an instrument. It became a message. It told the people that silence was safety, that to question authority was to risk vanishing into history's shadows. But every invention made to suppress truth eventually meets someone strong enough to defy it. And soon the silencer would face its greatest test, not against an army, but against a single woman whose courage would expose the limits of fear. They were not queens or warriors. Most were women whose only crime was refusing to disappear. Some were midwives accused of heresy for practicing medicine without the church's blessing. Others were widows who managed estates without a man's approval. A few were poets who wrote verses about faith and freedom. To the world of men, they had stepped too far into forbidden light. The first to face the silencer was a scholar named Anne Weston. She was known in London's narrow streets for her quiet brilliance. She could quote scripture, speak Latin, and write with eloquence that unsettled even priests. When the Crown outlawed certain religious texts, Anne refused to burn hers. She was taken to the Tower, accused of corrupting women with dangerous thought. For 3 days she was questioned, not with chains or flames, but with the silencer. The officials recorded only that she yielded not. No more was written, but something remarkable happened after her release. Though frail and shaken, Anne's resolve had not broken. She began to write again, her new work smuggled through secret presses across England. Each page bore the same inscription: "Silence is not obedience." Her words spread farther than her captors ever imagined. Others followed her path. Eleanor Marsh, a seamstress from York, was accused of spreading treasonous speech after reading Anne's verses aloud. When questioned, she admitted everything and added, "Words are not treason, fear is." Her courage cost her freedom, but her defiance sparked a movement. The stories of these women reached the taverns, markets, and even the royal court. The more the authorities tried to erase their voices, the louder the whispers became. In a time when women were told their silence was their virtue, every act of speech, every letter, every prayer, every song became an act of rebellion. And yet not all survived their defiance. Some vanished without record, their names erased from the scrolls. Others were said to have confessed, though no confession was ever found. History remembers their absence, not their words. But in that absence lies their message, that silence forced is not peace. It is the echo of injustice. As the years passed, the silencer became a phantom. Its use grew rare, its mention forbidden. But its legend endured, whispered among midwives and writers who warned one another of the room that takes your voice. To them, it was no longer a device of iron. It was a symbol of what power fears most, a woman who refuses to bow. The revolution of words had begun not with armies, but with ink and courage. What the crown had built to quiet rebellion had instead inspired it. By the end of that decade, even high-born ladies at court began quoting Anne Weston's words behind closed doors. The whispers had become a movement, and the movement an awakening. The silencer had achieved what it was made for. It created silence, but not the silence of submission, the silence before a storm. Her name was Margaret Clitherow, though few records of her remain. In most accounts, she appears only as the woman from Canterbury, but her story survived in letters passed secretly among women who refused to be forgotten. Margaret was not born noble. She was the daughter of a printer, a craftsman who had once risked his life producing banned books. From him, she learned to read, to think, and to question. When he was arrested for publishing unapproved scriptures, she continued his work in secret, smuggling pamphlets of faith and freedom across the city. It did not take long for her to be discovered. Brought before the council, she stood unshaken as they listed her crimes: sedition, defiance, and unauthorized printing. But when asked if she repented, she replied calmly, "I repent only my silence, not my words." Her composure infuriated them. A woman showing no fear was a threat greater than any army, and so they ordered her taken to the Tower to face the silencer. The records of her questioning are brief but telling. They speak of a long night of repeated counsel and of no confession obtained. Whatever form the device took, whether mechanical or psychological, it failed to claim her spirit. The guards who attended her later described her not as broken, but radiant. One testified years later that as dawn approached, she turned to him and said, "You think silence is power, but silence is the only thing that dies." Word of her endurance spread through the city like fire through dry wood. Even those loyal to the crown could not help but admire her strength. Within weeks, London's taverns and markets were filled with quiet talk of the woman who spoke without words. Her imprisonment created a problem for those in power. They had built the silencer to inspire obedience, but Margaret's survival had transformed it into a symbol of resistance. Every whisper of her name undid years of fear. The authorities tried to erase her, burning her writings, sealing the records. But it was too late. The idea had escaped. Soon after, Parliament ordered the instrument dismantled. The official decree cited moral inconsistency and unfitting cruelty. In truth, It had become a political liability, a reminder that no device, however cruel, could conquer conviction. Margaret was released quietly, with no trial and no explanation. Some say she fled England. Others claim she returned to her father's workshop and continued printing under a new name. No one knows where she died, but her words, passed from one generation to the next, remained. You may quiet my voice, but not my truth. By the time her story faded from official history, the legend had already taken root. The Crown had built the silencer to erase one voice, and instead had given birth to 1,000. In the months after Margaret Clio's release, something began to change in England, not loudly, not in open rebellion, but in small, deliberate acts of courage. Fear, once absolute, began to crack. Merchants in the city spoke her name in whispers, poets hid verses in their manuscripts, and midwives passed her words along with their prayers. You may quiet my voice, but not my truth. It became a secret anthem, repeated quietly, then boldly. The government tried to suppress the growing murmurs by tightening laws on printing and speech. But what they didn't understand was that the idea had already escaped their reach. It no longer lived on paper, it lived in memory, and memory was the one thing no authority could seize. Even among the king's own advisers, questions began to rise. If a woman could withstand the silencer without confessing, what did that say about the righteousness of their cause? If control required cruelty, was it truly strength or weakness disguised as power? In the tower itself, the once feared chambers grew quiet. The artisans who had built the device were dismissed, their blueprints destroyed. The officials who had ordered its creation avoided mentioning it altogether. It was as though the silencer had never existed, but its shadow remained, not in metal or records, but in guilt. The age of unquestioned obedience was ending. The same empire that had believed it could master truth through force now faced an uncomfortable realization. Silence could no longer guarantee loyalty. Margaret Clio had not started a revolution. At least, not in the way historians describe them. There were no banners, no battles, no proclamations. Her victory was quieter, but no less powerful. She had proven that endurance could outlast terror. By the turn of the century, the language of authority itself began to soften. Courts spoke of justice, not correction. Priests spoke of mercy more than punishment. A generation raised, under fear, began to crave compassion, and, in the pages of a banned pamphlet, smuggled out of London in 1603, an anonymous author wrote, "They built a device to take our voices. Instead, it gave us a reason to speak." The author's name was never found. Scholars believe those words were Margaret's, her final message to a world she had already changed. The tower stood for centuries more, its stones heavy with secrets, but the silencer was never rebuilt. It lived on only as a rumor, a warning, and a lesson. Power can build machines to quiet truth, but truth, once spoken, has no off switch. Centuries passed, and the Tower of London became a monument, its stones washed clean by rain and memory. Tourists walked where prisoners once prayed, and guides spoke of kings, queens, and wars, but never of the silencer. Its name was erased from archives, its purpose forgotten by all but those who studied the shadows of history. Yet the legacy of its silence lived on. Every generation finds its own version of control, not through chains or devices, but through words, judgment, and fear. The same forces that once sought to quiet women in dark chambers still whisper in subtler ways today. In the doubt that greets a woman's voice, in the ridicule faced by those who challenge power, in the fear of speaking truth in a world that rewards silence. The story of the silencer is no longer just about Tudor England. It is about every age that tries to disguise obedience as peace. The names change, the tools evolve, but the purpose remains the same: to make people question their right to speak, to think, to exist without permission. But Margaret Clio's defiance left behind something stronger than steel, a pattern of courage that history repeats whenever freedom begins to fade. Her endurance became a thread woven through time, resurfacing in each woman who dared to write, to protest, to stand her ground when silence was safer. In the 19th century, suffragists carried her spirit into the streets. In the 20th, journalists and teachers invoked her words when censorship loomed. And in the present, her message still beats quietly beneath movements that demand truth. "You may quiet my voice, but not my truth." Those words have outlived kings, empires, and the fear that created the silencer. They remind us that every attempt to erase truth only proves its power. When historians uncovered fragments of the old Tower records in the modern era, they found a single line written by an unknown clerk. "The chamber has been sealed. Let no one speak of it again." And yet here we are, speaking of it still. That is the paradox of silence. The more it is imposed, the louder its absence becomes. The women who faced the silencer left behind no monuments, but they left something far more enduring, the proof that even in the darkest places, courage can find its voice. History often remembers its inventions of war, the swords, the guns, the engines of conquest, but the inventions of silence are harder to trace. They leave no monuments, only empty spaces where voices once lived. The silencer was one of those creations, not just a machine, but an idea. It taught rulers that control could be cleaner than cruelty, that fear could be disguised as order. And yet, even the quietest tyranny meets its echo. For every device built to suppress truth, there rises someone who refuses to yield, someone who reminds the world that silence is not peace, and obedience is not loyalty. The women who faced the silencer did not overthrow kingdoms or lead armies. Their rebellion was smaller: a word, a prayer, a refusal to confess what was not true. But from such small defiance, the foundations of change were laid. Their courage traveled beyond their time, becoming a voice for all who would ever be told to keep quiet. Centuries later, their story still asks the same question. When power demands your silence, what will you do with your voice? The tower has grown still, its chambers filled with the hush of history, but the echo remains, the soft murmur of those who would not be broken. And as long as their words survive in memory, the silencer has already failed, because no device, no rule, and no fear can outlast the sound of truth spoken, even once.